Hey everyone, this is John Hansworth with the LBL Group. We're here again today with Maggie Mortali from AFSP, that's the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. And so Maggie's going to be presenting to us her workplace training that she takes groups and employers and communities through on mental health training, mental health awareness, and suicide prevention. And just to give you some background, I'm going to let Maggie introduce herself here in a second, but depression and suicide and mental health awareness has been kind of a bigger theme this year, obviously with everything going on due to COVID. With us sheltering in place and limited personal contact and job, financial, and health stressors, there's been a lot going on that's been affecting people. And I think, Maggie, would you agree that you've probably been seeing an uptick in interest in some of these programs? How has that been?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, there's a lot more just conversations happening about workplace mental health and also just with that comes talk about, suicidal ideation and thoughts, plans, behaviors. And I think there is a growing interest in suicide prevention and really kind of embedding it into workplace, HR, and mental health support services.
Mm-hmm. Got it. And then can you share a little bit, what's your background with AFSP? How long have you been with the organization?
Sure. Yeah. So I've been with the organization since 2011. And in my role, I'm the senior program director. So I work with our chief medical officer, our research team, our prevention education group. And my role specifically is working with institutions of higher education, organizations, and workplaces to put together what we really consider to be comprehensive suicide prevention strategies, along with post-vention work as well. So support services and resources in the aftermath of an employee or student suicide death.
Got it.
Yeah.
Cool. And you have a background, you have an MPH. What was what did you kind of specialize in when you were at school, and where did that take you? How did that lead you to where you are today?
Sure. So I have my MPH from Emory University, Rollins School of Public Health, and I actually got that when I was working full-time at AFSP. I did my full-time grad school work there, and with a focus in prevention science. And what was really unique, I think, about the program at the time was that suicide was just sort of becoming a public health issue, or always been a public health issue or a public health problem. But I think the suicide prevention field has really been within sort of the research realm of things, and very focused on the individual and their own mental health. And I think we've seen in the last several decades this transition into really using public health models for suicide prevention. So it was just a really unique time to be working in public health and studying in public health as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, usually setting is that we're talking back and forth, asking questions and things like that. But today you have a presentation for us. So I want to hand over controls, let you run the show, and then I'll just pipe in with questions as we go. Okay.
Perfect. Sounds great. All right. Thanks, John.
Yeah. Thanks, Maggie.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And this is a presentation called Talk Saves Lives, Suicide Prevention Education for Workplace Settings. And this is really an introductory into suicide prevention. And really the goals of this presentation are to provide an overview of the scope of the problem of suicide. So it will start with kind of going into the scope of the problem of suicide, the statistics about the suicide globally, as well as in the United States. And then it'll transition into suicide risk factors and warning signs, and then the prevention of suicide. So what are things we can all do, the role we sort of all play in suicide prevention. And I'll spend some time today going through the presentation and really kind of highlighting some of the sections here as we go. And please, feel free to ask questions as we go along.
Yep, I'll keep an eye on the chat box, Maggie, and I'll let you know if anything comes in, okay?
Perfect. So one of the things that we always make very clear when we talk about suicide is that certainly suicide is a public health problem, a public health issue, and can be quite complex. And I say that meaning there are intersecting factors that put someone at risk for suicide. So when we talk about suicide, it's never kind of one reason or one answer to the question, why did someone die by suicide? It's a complex public health issue. But despite its complexity, suicide is preventable and can be prevented. We also have specific language that we use when we talk about suicide. And so while you may have heard the term, committed suicide, we typically avoid using that term committed suicide or saying a failed or successful attempt. And this really goes back to talking about suicide like a public health issue. And so, for example, we wouldn't necessarily say, committed cancer or committed a heart attack. We say died from cancer or died of a heart attack. And so the same is really true for suicide. And so therefore we encourage the use of phrases like died by suicide or death by suicide. Some of the other terminology that we will use when talking about suicide are terms like suicide loss survivor, survivor of suicide loss, or suicide bereaved, bereaved by suicide. And these are all terms that are used to describe those individuals, whether they're family members, friends, coworkers of someone who has died by suicide. And then in addition, and this is sort of a newer term, which is the term lived experience. And this really refers to someone who has made a suicide attempt or is living with suicidal thoughts, plans, or behaviors. That's considered to be someone with lived experience.
Yeah, and Maggie, is it? Do you all have like PR resources? I think, right, when there is a loss that's public that you share with news organizations and whatnot, so they understand how to talk about suicide.
Absolutely, yes. So we have afsp.org/media has a list of resources for really geared towards the media, but also just talking about suicide that kind of goes through these terms, and also how to safely report on suicide. Making sure that when there are stories about suicide, that the headlines are never sort of sensationalizing the death, that they're not talking about the exact methods of the suicide death, that they're not showing, pictures of lethal means, and that whenever they're reporting the story, that they're referencing the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline as a resource for help. It's a great question. And that kind of goes into really looking at the scope of the problem of suicide, really kind of globally and also in this country. And unfortunately, suicide is on the rise. It's a global health problem as well. There's over 800,000 people that die by suicide globally each year. And then in the United States, we're looking at just over 48,000 suicide deaths in 2018, which is the most recent year for when statistics are available. This data is captured and reported by the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, and is collected in 32 states across the United States. So again, it's probably most likely an underestimate, but regardless, we are seeing rates about 34% in the last 18 years. And then when we look at the working age population, suicide is the fourth leading cause of death among individuals who are 16 to 64 years old. So it's a wide range age group, but that's really how the working age population is defined in this country. And we've seen about a 40% increase in that age group since 2000 as well.
Is there any push, Maggie, from a legislative standpoint to I guess, equalizing how suicide gets reported across states? Because it's interesting to me that you said about 32 states are like accurately reporting on it. So the other 18, is there a push to get them to kind of step up to the level that everyone else is at? Is there any noise going on
Absolutely.
at the legislative level?
Absolutely. So the National Violent Death Reporting System is the database that's run by the CDC, the NVDRS, and that's the database for all violent deaths in this country. And so it's not just suicide that's underreported. It's all violent deaths that are captured through NVDRS. NVDRS are run kind of almost like clinics actually in these 32 states, and they have really are collecting information from death investigators, medical examiners, from violent deaths across the state, and they're collecting that data and then implementing it into this national database. But there's a huge advocacy effort. AFSP has a field advocacy program, and we have been pushing to have the NVDRS in all 50 states. And so that legislation was passed. It's just now really about rolling it out and implementing it in those remaining 18 states.
Got it.
Yeah. And so when we talk about suicide, we also, whenever we talk sort of about the scope of the problem and the way that the rates are increasing and reported, we also talk about the impact that it has on those that are left behind. And I think this truly kind of encapsulates the real impact that this leading cause of death has on this country and really again globally, because it's estimated that most Americans will experience a suicide loss over their lifetime. And we know that any death has an impact on families and friends and communities, and suicide is truly no different than that. And workplaces are also impacted, whether it's through the death of the employee themselves or an employee's family member, or a suicide loss of a colleague or a client or a vendor. This truly has such an impact. And so again, that kind of puts that perspective in the importance of both suicide prevention, but also suicide postvention and supporting those who have lost someone to suicide. And that's really where, I think our work in workplaces is focused on both aspects of suicide prevention and postvention. So one of the things that's really important is sort of understanding and having a really general knowledge about suicide risk factors and warning signs. We will typically talk about risk factors first. These are really the kind of characteristics or conditions that increase the chance that a person may take their life. They are intersecting. So this, not any one health factor or historical factor, environmental factor is going to put someone at risk for suicide. It's really the convergence of those risk factors that increase the likelihood or the chance that someone will take their life. And so I think health factors are kind of the most common that are talked about, right? Biological and psychological factors, the most significant of which when we're talking about suicide risk are mental health conditions. When we talk about sort of mental health conditions in this country, depression is the most common mental health condition that is associated with suicide risk, but also bipolar disorder as well, although bipolar disorder is less common than depression just as a diagnosable mental health condition. And so it really is depression that, again, is most contributing to someone's suicide risk. But again, that doesn't tell the whole picture, right? So 1 in 5 Americans have a diagnosable mental health condition, but the majority of people that have mental health conditions do not die by suicide. And so that's really, again, speaks to the kind of multiple intersecting or interacting even risk factors. And so in addition to health factors, we often talk a lot about historical factors. So this could include a family history of suicide or a family history of mental health conditions. Again, typically when undiagnosed and therefore untreated, and past trauma. There's a lot of newer research about looking at psychological autopsies, which means really studying the person, sort of the decedent, after they've died by suicide, interviewing family members and friends, and really getting an understanding of the person and their life. And that's really how we've learned so much about these historical factors, is really through that research. And
That's a new
then,
term. I've never heard that term before, a psychological autopsy.
yeah, so psychological autopsies are, I would say, we haven't actually, AFSP is working to fund some newer psychological autopsy studies because they haven't been done in over a decade. And the kind of most cited psychological autopsy studies showed that about 90%, just over 90% of folks who died by suicide had a mental health condition at the time of their death, although it was often undiagnosed and untreated. And so it was really, again, just understanding from the families the symptomology of this person and what was going on, to get a sense of that, this person really sounds like they were struggling from depression or struggling with bipolar disorder, anxiety. So that has really been at the kind of forefront of the suicide risk factor research into both mental health conditions and historical factors. And so there's a lot of interest from the science community, the suicidologists, as they're called, folks who study suicide, to really engage in some newer psychological autopsy studies.
Got it. And then what does it do? So you mentioned the 1 in 5 Americans has a psychological, condition. What does that do between it being diagnosed and undiagnosed? What does that do for mortality rates? And obviously there's a lot of causation and stuff going on there. But if someone has a condition, but it hasn't been diagnosed potentially, does that increase their risks of suicide? Does it prevent them obviously from getting treatment if they don't have a condition diagnosed? What results are there when someone's undiagnosed?
Yeah, that's such a good question too. And I think, in the United States, so 1 in 5 adults have a mental health condition, or it's, approximately have a mental health condition any given year, and only 1 in 3 seek treatment. So we are talking about the majority of folks that are struggling with depression, anxiety, bipolar, are not getting the help and support they need. And yes, it absolutely can increase risk for mortality, again, with a combination of historical factors and environmental factors can increase the risk for suicide. But we also know that untreated depression has a huge impact on physical health as well. Chronic pain, heart disease, diabetes, in sleep disorders. I mean, it really has a huge impact on the sort of mortality, but also kind of morbidity in this country as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so environmental factors, these are probably some of the ones we kind of, as outsiders, right, see the most, we're kind of most aware of, right? We know about the coworkers, stressful life events, or we hear about a recent divorce or breakup. And so environmental factors are often what kind of get misassumed as the kind of the answer of why someone died by suicide, right? you'll see stories in the news, this so-and-so died by suicide, they were being bullied, or they recently got laid off, or, there was a recent divorce. That, but there's, again, it never tells the kind of whole story here. And so it's usually that environmental factors, and really what the research has shown is that they don't lead to suicide on their own. It's really when a health or historical factor, usually both, are at play, that these environmental factors contribute to an escalation in risk. And the most common is access to lethal means. So if someone doesn't have the means to kill themselves, that mitigates risk almost immediately. And so in some of the next section on prevention, I'll really talk about how most suicide prevention efforts, most successful suicide prevention efforts involve mitigating or reducing, limiting access to lethal means. And that's not just firearms, it's bridge barriers and carbon emission sensors in cars. It's safety measures on parking garages and buildings. It's really the whole kind of scope of lethal means restriction. And then in the workplace, really making these cultural shifts so that the environment is safe, right? That not just the physical space, but the emotional space as well. We know that when folks are have increased job insecurity, or there's a kind of lack of variety or autonomy in their work. What we're seeing now, while we don't know, the kind of outcomes of what's happening now in this country as it relates to suicide risk, and there's some preliminary data that's not showing any increase in suicide deaths, but there is definitely an increase in the stressors right now, and particularly when it comes to what we call this work-family conflict or family-work conflict. And that's really when the kind of work demands make family responsibilities more difficult, or the family responsibilities make work more difficult. And so what the focus of the kind of upstream suicide prevention work is really to address that as workplace culture, and add in some flexibility for folks, especially right now when there's that increased job strain due to the COVID and also environmental factors outside of that as well. And so when we kind of put these things together, this is just an example that I like to use. It kind of goes back to the what we know, what we often see, and this is just a kind of to just kind of talk through if your coworker recently died by suicide, as his colleague, even someone not close with him, you may have noticed that. Or you may have known that he was going through a divorce. You kind of saw interactions with him and folks at work, and there was certainly more stress. Maybe he went out for that, a kind of promotion and was overlooked. But then on the other side, what you probably wouldn't know as a coworker or colleague is that, he had a family history of suicide, that he had, been struggling with depression. Maybe it was, treated before, but it kind of resurged and it wasn't getting currently treated. And that, to sort of, self-soothe the depression, he was drinking more than usual. These are the things that you just may not really fully know as someone, who's a colleague of someone who's really struggling. We as humans can be really good at hiding our depression or hiding our struggle. And so that's to say that it's not the responsibility of any of us to know everything that's going on of everyone else, but it's also to say that the environmental factors are never just the reason or the cause for suicide. It's really that that impact of the health factors, that depression, that those historical factors, the drink, of the family history of suicide, the drinking more than usual, that combination, and then what we would call the precipitating event is usually the environmental factor, that recent divorce, that being overlooked of sense of, causes a sense of hopelessness and despair. And that's really—
Seems like a classic tip of the iceberg situation,
that's
right?
exactly right. That's exactly right. And so while this life event can be this precipitating role, and really in that feel like this cause, right? It's that without those other underlying risk factors, those life events alone are not enough to cause suicide. And so that's really kind of how we talk about the complexity of suicide, but it's just the intersectionality of these risk factors. That's really what we talk about. And then to go into kind of how that almost plays out, that's really what our suicide warning signs. And those are really risk factors kind of happen over time, right? We're talking about family history, a mental health condition. These are things that happen over a longer period of time. Warning signs are really observable signs that can signal suicide risk in the near future. It's not necessarily, again, imminent, especially if there's limited access to lethal means, right? But it really is, what are the things that we can notice that may signal that someone is maybe thinking about suicide? And that's really what we call the talk, behavior, and mood. We kind of break it down into three main categories. And talk is truly that. Like, there are folks that talk about ending their lives, right? That it can be very direct. Sometimes it's more indirect, right? Seems a little bit more abstract almost, right? Like having no reason to live, or I'm a burden to others. That it can kind of feel a little bit more about like someone talking about feeling that they're trapped, or that they are in unbearable pain. And that is just, when we're kind of thinking about what that looks like and how that plays out, it's really important to remember that every person is different. And so sometimes folks may keep their kind of feelings more hidden, but their language is displaying kind of more directly this potential suicide risk. And so it could even mean that someone might like make a joke about it, right? Or they might just sort of hint at the despair that they have. But really there's no matter how a person talks about suicide, whether it's joking, it's subtle, the most important thing is to take it seriously. I mean, that really is it, just taking it seriously. And so what I really like to say here is that there's a myth out there that talking or asking someone about suicide puts that idea in their head or puts someone at risk for suicide. And that is a myth. In fact, asking someone about suicide, are you thinking about suicide, does not put the idea in their head. If they weren't thinking about it, they'll tell you. And if not, they may feel really taken care of and seen. And so even when someone's, says, makes a joke, oh, I should just kill myself, it's really okay to say, hey, sometimes when people talk about, killing themselves, even if they're joking about it, it may mean that they're going through a really tough time. Are you doing okay? Are you thinking about killing yourself? Are you thinking about ending your life? That is absolutely an okay way to kind of bridge that gap and really connect with someone on an emotional level. And if they say, no, I was just joking around about it, you can say, okay, well, sometimes when people joke about it, I just, I want to take that something like that seriously. And so if you ever are thinking about it, you know that you can always reach out to me, or there are folks out there that really care about you and who are here from you. And so even in that moment, you can kind of formulate that connection that even if they were kind of joking, or maybe there was some truth to it, you've really shown them that you're a person that they can trust. And so that's really where that talk is so important. And especially if they're displaying other types of warning signs. And so that really gets us into behavior. This is probably the most just full slide of the presentation, but because can be so different for every person. And that's because, again, every person is different, but some things I'll just kind of draw attention to here is really about, it's going to be major changes in the person's behavior. So if it's someone who notoriously has issues with sleep, that may not be the behavior that you're kind of looking at for this. But maybe there are significant changes to their physical appearance. Maybe they are acting, more recklessly, and this was someone that was never reckless at all, right? That it's going to be these changes in someone's behavior. One of my really good friends made a suicide attempt several years ago, and I, as their friend, a sort of newer friend, I didn't necessarily know those warning signs in my friend. After they made their suicide attempt, we talked about those warning signs, and there were things that, like turning off social media and disconnecting, that I just didn't know that was the warning sign of that person, right? And so now I know if I see they're taking a break from social media, I'm going to text that friend and say, hey, I haven't seen, you posting on Facebook in a few days. I just wanted to check in and see if how everything's going, or if everything's okay. And so again, these are someone's behaviors, but it can sometimes be unique to them. And that's another part of this too, is just understanding and having those kind of honest conversations about what folks are going through.
So I think that's a tricky thing then, right? Because then an issue you have is you need to have enough experience with someone to have established a baseline.
Absolutely.
Right, of what their behavior, their normal behavior, but non-crisis behavior, I guess, would be, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some people are much better at hiding it than others, right? So I think sometimes, again, we're looking at like the combination of behaviors. It wouldn't just be my friend like not going on social media. It would also be that they were drinking maybe more than usual, or they were feeling down and depressed or more irritable. And they were kind of a social friend, so I was really close to them through social media, and so I wasn't witnessing some more observable signs. But I say that because I think what in the aftermath of that is I've really been able to kind of look at, okay, what are some other ways that I can connect with people and their warning signs when I may not be seeing them day to day. And I think that's so important, especially now, is when we are distant from each other, then how can we kind of connect with folks and see some of these more signs that, maybe we're not in the workplace every day seeing folks day in and day out, but that there are other ways that we can kind of pick up on those clues through, actually, I'll go back to that behavior sign again, missed work or declining work. Now maybe it's missing Zoom meetings, right? Or being late to meetings. Maybe it's canceling, repeatedly canceling days, or taking, additional personal days or extra time more immediately. This can also be, maybe the one not to look for right now is changes in physical appearance, right? Because
Right.
we've noticed during this time, I've got a ton of colleagues that have beards now, or, myself, I'm letting out my grays a little bit, but that's a sort of symptom of the quarantine more so than, other observable like risk factor warning signs. So sometimes it's also in the context of the culture and what's going on. But it's always it kind of goes back to that it's always okay to ask if someone's okay. So even if you think like it might be because of quarantine, or it might be because things are really stressful right now and they've got 2 kids at home and they're doing, Zoom school, but like
Right.
I should just check in with them anyway and just see how they're doing and how things are going. So
Yeah, I mean, is that like, I want to put a pin in that actually, because you and I, before we started broadcasting, we were talking about burnout.
yes.
Is that going to come up later in the presentation?
Yeah, we talk about it in prevention, a lot
Okay.
more kind of prevention of burnout, but we could certainly talk about, so burnout just sort of as an observable, as a sign. Burnout is really sort of looks very much like chronic stress, but it is very much related to work and the
Mhm.
relationship with work and the work environment. And so that and also that the dynamic too of the work and family kind of stress and strain, but often the behavior that can show that someone may be experiencing burnout are very similar to the behaviors that are laid out on this slide. And the especially like difficulties with colleagues, any HR issues, the missed work and declining work is huge,
Mhm.
but also a kind of change in work-life dynamic. So it could be that it could be the opposite of missing work. It could be this sort of surge of working way too much. We know that working way too much can impact burnout, but sometimes it's also a symptom of burnout, right? The behavior is I have to get this done. I have to always be working.
Right.
And so really long and extended hours. Also almost a kind of misunderstanding of the importance and prioritization, right? Because there's that stress and strain. And so not being able to kind of get organized and go through tasks, prioritizing things, everything just feels important and overwhelming. And it really is a kind of convergence of stress and strain due to work.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think about that with, there's the thing that's come up in sheltering at home and people working from home is this like huge chasm of difference and experience between like people like myself, where I live with my girlfriend and we have our dog
Right.
and we're just doing our own thing. And then, someone who maybe is trying to get, 2 or 3 kids set up on Zoom, and they're also needing to answer emails, and they're in a leadership position at their company. So they feel like they need to have an increased presence virtually because they can't just poke their head into someone's office or walk by their cubicle. Like there's such a difference in experience there. I think that, are you anticipating that's probably going to have an effect on burnout too? Because like you're
Yeah.
suddenly playing, IT tech for your kids, teacher for your
Yep.
kids, keeping them on schedule. And then all the meanwhile, you feel you have these increased responsibilities for work.
That's absolutely right. And the key here is flexibility. And I think, folks that are used to working from home, like when their job is remote, it's the flexibility is typically built into that. But for the folks like even myself, where I was a 9 to 5 in the office and now I'm remote, transitioning to remote and 9 to 5 is not flexible. And I think what what we're encouraging organizations to do is really to build in the flexibility for employees to really have be able to kind of make their own hours through the day and have that trust that your employees want to get their work done, and they will get their work done. It just may not happen in the hours of 9 to 5. It has to be more flexible. And I think it's one thing to say that, it's another thing to build that time in. So another piece to this is organizational leadership is critical here in building in that not just it's, we want you to be flexible, and it's, we understand that things need to be flexible, but saying we'll build in that time, that it's not, no one is expected to, be on 9 to 5. If you need to have if you're doing schooling during the morning with your kids and you need to book out your afternoon, then that's okay. And then the expectations for response times need to change too, right? So what you were saying is, if my colleagues are working 9 to 5 and I've got kids at home and I'm trying to navigate that, then I don't want that expectation of having to respond to that email in an hour, right? Everyone needs to kind of understand the new framework around work. And that is so critical to burnout, because a lot of this is what happens is, even when folks know that they have the flexibility, or they're being told, right, that they can have that flexibility, there's a guilt there too, right? And so the last thing you want to happen is for someone to be, doing, like, building out their flexible hours, but then the whole time thinking about what is happening on my, with my inbox, what calls am I missing? Because then there's not that work-family balance. It's just completely in conflict. And that's really important too. So it's not just about saying things can be flexible, it's actually providing the space for things to be flexible and build out that flexibility, and really having, honest conversations about expectations for response times and hours of the day when meetings are happening. I know a lot of organizations are doing quiet hours a couple times a week, and that's such an important piece to this too, because I think the stress of just the email inbox is something that happens a lot as well, and all of that can heighten burnout.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. So quickly I'll go through the mood. And this is kind of what we would assume, right? That someone is, feeling kind of hopeless and desperate and in despair, that they're down, they're depressed. A lot of times this can play out as anger or just agitation and kind of irritability, right? If you're not feeling like yourself, and a lot of times with depression, there can be this kind of hopelessness feeling, and also not really understanding like what you're going through is depression. And so some folks really feel like there's something wrong with them, but they don't know what or why and what's going on. And so that can really, this has this sort of dynamic too with someone's mood. And that really is, can play out in a variety of ways. And so the last thing that I'll do before we kind of go into questions is I'll just kind of quickly go through this last section, which is about prevention, and really how it relates back to those risk factors and warning signs. And this slide here just really talks about protective factors. And so this is really, when we talk about protective factors, we're saying that just like there are those risk factors, right, that increase a person's risk for suicide, there are also factors that reduce a person's risk for suicide. And that's what's known as a protective factor. And this is, certainly if someone is struggling with depression or anxiety, chronic stress and burnout, accessing mental health care is critical here. It also can be the kind of the attitude or the approach to mental health care. So maybe they're not struggling with a diagnosable mental health condition. You know, maybe they're going through sort of situational depression, especially right now with what's going on, or increased anxiety because of the global pandemic.
Mhm.
So that just that attitude towards mental health and mental health treatment, and that often then comes with the ability then to move into more self-directed tools like an app therapy or mindfulness and meditation, and really ways to take care of their own mental health. This is also critical to this is social and support and community connectedness. I think one of the things we have experienced through this global pandemic is kind of how do we transition that when we can't physically be together, and what are ways that we can use kind of technology or letter writing or community neighborhood kind of drive-bys to or in New York City where we kind of we're banging our pots and pans out of our windows every day at 7 for healthcare workers. That is that connectedness. And so of course being together physically is so important to that, but it's not measured by that. It's really what community means to the person and how they feel supported in that. And that kind of goes into effective coping skills. And so, and that can be really challenging, right? When you're feeling down, you're feeling depressed, you're feeling hopeless, it can often be looking for things that are going to make you feel immediately better. And sometimes those things are not healthy, right? It's unhealthy foods, it's alcohol or substances. And so, but that over time deteriorates. And so it's remembering in these times or building out self-care strategies when you're feeling well, so that when you're struggling, you have that thing to go to. It's not in the moment of when you're feeling down or depressed or anxious to start building that list.
Right.
It's really to do that ahead of time as a kind of self-care strategy. And then belief systems, right? Feeling connected to spiritual or often religious beliefs, particularly those that have a sense of connection and community. And then always, going back to mitigating access or reducing access to lethal means, that is a protective factor. And so particularly during this time, we've talked about, if folks are in their home, making sure that home is safe and people can feel, protected in their environments as well. So with that, that's really the kind of scope of this program. And I wanted to, of course, make sure we have time for questions as well.
Yeah, totally. I guess I'll ask a question. So what do you think employers who are effectively handling this with their employees, or what are the right things they can do, or things to put them on the right path towards creating some of that connection? Because we've had that internally. We did a cooking class virtually for everyone. So we had 15 different Zooms going all at once with one person taking us through how to make paella, right?
Yeah.
And so that was kind of a bonding experience, and it was a little discombobulated, but that became part of it, right? We were all just at some point going to end up with something that could be called paella, and we just made it happen. What are other examples of things that companies can do to work on that?
Yeah, that's such a good example. And I have this saying, and it's not my saying, it's a saying that I use a lot: culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? So you can have the best strategy for your workplace and a terrible culture, and it's just, you're not going to be able to achieve that mission and goals. And so it's really important to make sure that your workplace really sets the tone, right? And leadership sets the tone for a culture that really supports folks' mental health and well-being overall. And so it goes back to that flexibility. It also is providing those opportunities for community and support and connectedness in the workplace and with your colleagues. A couple things we've done and other folks have done that we really recommend are certainly those Zoom opportunities where it's not focused on work, right? It's a cooking class, or I have a colleague that is a certified yoga instructor, and so she did a kind of drop-in Zoom yoga a couple times a month, and that's a nice way of not only bonding with your colleagues or staying connected, but it also learning interests that and skills that your colleagues may have that you didn't know about. And that's so important too, is connecting with your coworkers and colleagues that on things that are just not only about work as well. Another thing we've done and something I recommend is, certainly building out a kind of more formal peer support program, but also a buddy system. Having that colleague that you can reach out to when you're struggling, but also when times are good. It's important to vent too. That is such an important thing too, and to have a colleague that you feel safe and you can vent to, and that you can often be a listening ear to as well, is really important. And having that, having the leadership kind of put out a buddy system and provide a kind of framework for that is really important too, because it acknowledges that it's okay to vent and it's okay to have a colleague that you need as a buddy in that way. And then certainly benefits, right? So policies and benefits in place that support mental health and certainly on as much as your physical health, opportunities to for self-care tools in addition to kind of formal mental health treatment. I know a lot of organizations, including our organization, we use Headspace for our employees. It's not an endorsement of Headspace, but just these apps that are out there for mindfulness and meditation, because again, people are sort of everyone has mental health, right? So self-directed tools and policies and benefits, that's the sort of full scope of the mental health spectrum. And so anything that organizations can do to provide those resources to folks should they need it is really, really important.
And Maggie, we had a question come in from Brenda. So Brenda was asking that, considering HIPAA laws, how involved can an employer get in helping employees access mental health care for anyone that they think is at risk?
That's a great question. And so it's really about providing resources, but keeping the boundaries of, you don't need to ask and shouldn't really ask unless it's, relevant, what someone is, you don't want diagnosis or condition or anything like that. But just like you would provide, support for someone who was dealing with a physical health issue, maybe they had surgery and were using crutches or a wheelchair, and you would figure out a way to accommodate that. The same is true for mental health and mental health accommodations. And in terms of, suicide attempts and kind of return to work, that should follow the same kind of return to work, the same policies and return to work for other health conditions, and also with suicide bereavement, we or postvention support, we recommend that those follow the same protocols that are in place for other types of loss or bereavement, and support that's available for employees. So it should really fall in line with what's true of other health conditions.
Got it. Okay, cool. Thank you. And I think last question that I've got on my side. So going back just because the burnout was something that we were talking about. The example, so as background for everyone, I was reading a book, Adam Grant's Give and Take, and in it, he talks about a teacher who was teaching at a high school in Philadelphia, and she was experiencing a lot of burnout because she's just spending, 12 hours a day working with students. And the issue there is that the payoff for working with those students, you might not see until years later. But, she's 25. I think she was 24 years old. She was working with Teach for America. And so she wasn't going to have that delayed gratification until a long time from now. And so she started mentoring on the weekends where she started seeing immediate gains in students. And that was giving her a ton of reward, right? She was getting a ton of reward for what she was doing. And that really invigorated her with what she was doing on a day-to-day basis on Monday through Friday. And so Maggie, do you think there's an opportunity for employers where, like I'm having that, I'm not sitting with my groups, I'm not sitting with my clients, I'm not looking at people really eye to eye, right? Right. There's a little bit of a disconnect from the impact we're having, and impact is so important, especially in today's day and age where so many people, we're doing sometimes incredibly granular things with technology or whatever, and we're not having that human connection. What are ways, techniques that companies maybe can remind their employees of the impact they're having so that they're not having that burnout, right?
Yes, such a good question. And impact is so important no matter what you do. And also feeling connected to the work, right? Or to the cause and the purpose. And so even when times are during work is high stress, connecting with that impact and the mission or the purpose of the work will sustain someone during those periods of stress. And so gratitude and appreciation is huge in this. And so recognition of employees and the work that they're doing, but really specifically what they're doing, what they're working on. Not you're all working so hard and you're so dedicated and passionate. That's great, but folks, that's important as well, I will say. But it's also about, calling attention to employees for, so-and-so, got this new client or was helping achieve our mission in this way, and being really specific about the work that they're doing, and also providing opportunities for employees, colleagues to share and highlight their peers. So one of the things that we've implemented, and I definitely recommend, we created a kind of colleague cheer board, and we send a daily update to our all staff every morning. And there's always a picture that an employee has, submitted. Maybe they're on a hike or, doing something, and there's that self-care element. And so, but it's an opportunity for people to connect and also kind of cheer each other on and highlight folks in that way.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I think that kind of covers the basis for us today. Maggie, if anyone wants to know more, if they want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
Perfect. So certainly go to afsp.org to get involved, and then send me an email. My email is mmortali@afsp.org, or you can just email workplace@afsp.org, and that goes directly to me as well.
Got it. Okay, cool. And then if, and I know because this question came up with us actually ahead of the webinar, if someone is interested in presenting something like Talk Saves Lives for workplace settings themselves, is that something as well they can reach out to you about if they're interested?
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for joining us today, everyone. Really hope you came away with something helpful from this. This is such an important cause for all of us. And if you have any questions, reach out. Keep an eye out for the recording. I'll put it up on YouTube, and we'll go from there. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Dan.
Bye. And thanks, Maggie.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.